the gospel writers say Jesus was buried.
Right.
Do you think that's true?
It seems to me that there are 4 fundamental historical facts which any credible historian must account for if he's to give a tenable historical hypothesis about the fate of Jesus of Nazareth. Mm-hmm. The first of these is the honorable burial of Jesus. The second of these is the discovery of his empty tomb. Third would be the post-mortem appearances of Jesus. And fourth would be the origin of the disciples' belief that Jesus was risen from the dead. Now, with respect to the first of those, the burial of Jesus, the majority of New Testament scholars who have written on this subject agree that Jesus of Nazareth was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb.
Joseph of Arimathea, isn't that a controversial point?
I was somewhat amused when Peter Jennings on the ABC special said that according to the Gospels, Jesus was laid in the tomb by his mother and his friends. Now, if the story of Jesus' burial were a late developing legend that accrued over the decades in the early Christian church, that is exactly the sort of pious story that one would expect to find. Jesus was buried by his devoted mother and his faithful disciples. But that's not, in fact, what the Gospels say. Instead, what the Gospels say is that Jesus of Nazareth was laid in a tomb by this enigmatic figure, Joseph of Arimathea, who appears out of nowhere in the Gospels, and contrary to expectation, gives Jesus of Nazareth an honorable burial in a tomb. Moreover, Mark tells us that this man was a member of the Sanhedrin, the very council which had just condemned Jesus to be crucified, and that Joseph singles out Jesus among the trio of men that had been crucified for special care by giving him an honorable burial in a tomb rather than allowing the body to simply be dispatched into a common grave reserved for criminals. This is extraordinary and requires some sort of explanation.
Okay, now why does that take precedence over, say, John Dominic Crossan's theory that he was just thrown on the trash heap and kind of chewed up by the dogs?
The burial account of Jesus has very strong and independent lines of evidence supporting it. One of the most important is that it's multiply attested in early sources in the New Testament.
Where?
This is one of the most important criteria of historicity, because if you have an early tradition that has independent attestation, then it's unlikely to be the result of legend or to have been made up.
Sure, and a lot of people say that it doesn't exist.
Well, we do in fact have multiple attestation of the burial tradition. For example, it's mentioned in the early tradition that is handed on by Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where the third line of this formula says that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised, and that he appeared. And the second line of this formula refers to Jesus' burial. This tradition has been dated to within 5 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. So this can't be written off as some sort of a legendary tale that accrued over the decades and eventually came to be written down in the Gospels. Moreover, when you compare this formula to the Gospel accounts on the one hand and the early sermons recorded in the Acts of the Apostles on the other, what you discover is that this 4-line tradition is an outline of the early Christian proclamation of the crucifixion, the burial by Joseph of Arimathea in the tomb, the resurrection of Jesus, the discovery of the empty tomb, and the appearing of Jesus to various witnesses. So that you have here multiple independent attestation of the burial as well as other portions of the tradition.
Isn't that what historians want?
Exactly.